Hello, I'm Jeremy and I'm here at the TRQ Research and Development Facility where we are installing a hub and bearing on this 2010 Toyota Rav4. So if you're looking for a hub and bearing for your car, find the TRQ brand because you know it's quality. Now, let's get started. We're gonna crack these lug nuts loose while the car is on the ground because once we jack up the car, it'll be much easier to take these lug nuts off. These are 21mm lug nuts. So now that the car is up in the air, we're going to take each one of these lug nuts off and then pull the wheel off. So I've now just taken off all 5 lug nuts, and as you can see, the wheel is stuck on the hub. So the easy way to fix this is to put one of the nuts back on. Just put it on finger tight. You're just trying to prevent the wheel from not falling off unexpectedly. And then we're going to go to the back side of the wheel and pop it off with a pry bar. We're going to just put it up here against the ball joint and pry against the wheel. And as you can see, it pops right off. And then we'll take the wheel off the car. So we want to remove this nut right here on the axle, but as you can see, it's been stamped down into this groove, and that holds it in place, so you don't need a cotter pin on it. But we need to basically bend this nut upward so that we can then spin the nut off and not destroy all the threads. If you were to just spin it off right now, you'd probably damage all these threads as you pull it off because this is dented downward. So what we're going to use is a punch and a hammer. And we're just going to tap on the inside of this to move this upward. All right, starting to move. So this center nut is a 30mm 12-point nut, which means you need a socket like this to remove it. And the tricky part is, if you try and turn this right now, it's going to turn the whole axle and the rotor as you're trying to loosen it. So there's a couple ways that you can deal with this. You can sometimes put the wheel back on the car and then take the center cap off. You have to set the car back on the ground, and then you can put the socket right through the center of the wheel with the wheel on the ground, and you can crack this loose, and then you can spin it off. Another method is if you have a friend, you can have a friend hop inside the car and hold the brakes, and that'll hold the brakes still, and then you can take this off with a big half-inch breaker bar. The other option is you can use an impact gun, which is what we're going to use. That way you don't need a friend inside the car and you don't need to put the wheel back on. So let's see how it goes. All right, that worked out pretty well. So this axle should be able to push in through the center of the hub, but it doesn't because it's rusty. So there's a couple ways to get around this. My favorite one is putting this nut right back on. You want to put it on until it's just about flush with the end, right here. And then I'll spray a little rust penetrant in there, so maybe it'll get inside where the axle is. And then I'm going to tap this with a hammer. And the reason I put the nut back on is because I don't want to damage the threads if I miss with the hammer. And if I did miss and I damaged the threads, then I would need to fix it. But with the nut on there, you at least hit the nut instead of the threads. It's a little easier to deal with. So let's see how it goes. All right, so that worked pretty great. So now you know the axle is loose. Right here and right here are your caliper bolts. They're both 14mm. We're going to take those out first. We'll start with the top one. We're using a 3/8 drive ratchet and a 14mm socket. Usually once you crack them loose, they come right out by hand. All right, so now we're at a point where we can pull the caliper off. What I like to do is pull on the caliper a little bit, and that compresses the piston inside it just a hair to release the caliper. So now the caliper's off, and we want to hang it from the strut because if you hang it from the hose, it'll damage the hose. So I have just an old coat hanger here, which I'm going to feed through the caliper and then hook onto the strut. And that should hold my caliper out of the way. So we're now at a point where we can pull these brake pads out. So we'll pull the first one out. Here's the front pad. You can see these pads are actually still good, but we're going to show you how to replace them anyways because that's why we make the videos. So we'll set these aside for now, And now we're going to remove these two bolts, which hold the caliper bracket onto the knuckle. Now they are 17 millimeters, so I'm going to use my 17 millimeter socket with a 3/8 drive ratchet, and I'm going to loosen them up. Now it may take some force, so a 1/2 inch ratchet might be a little easier, but let's try it out. Looks like it worked. Now we'll go to the bottom one. All right, with those bolts out, now you can pull the caliper bracket right off the car. So now we're at a point where we can pull this rotor off, but as you can see, it's stuck on there pretty good. They usually get stuck right around the center, just from rusting against the hub. So luckily, what a lot of manufacturers do is they put these two holes in the rotor, which you can thread bolts into, and that bolt will push against the hub, and it will bring the rotor right off the car. So what we're gonna do is spray it with some rust penetrant, just to kind of clean it out a little bit, like so. And then we grabbed a couple of bolts from our bucket of bolts that we have laying around, and we're gonna thread these right into the holes. All right, so now we're gonna just tighten them up, and hopefully this rotor will just pull right off the hub. You can see it starting to release on this side. So let's go to the other side and tighten that up. Hey, that's great. All right, so now the rotor's off. You can pull it off and you can see the rust buildup around here. That's what holds the rotor on. And then you can see the 2 points where we push the bolt against it. All right, let's move on. All right, so these are the 4 bolts that hold the hub to the knuckle. There's 4 of them. They're all 17 millimeters. And they go through the knuckle and into the hub. And they're usually very tight. So one tip is to spray some rust penetrant on the front side of the threads, and that will hopefully make it a little easier pulling these things out. All right, so now we're gonna crack them loose. We're gonna push the axle in so we get a little space to work with, and then we'll use our 17 millimeter and our ratchet to break them loose. All right, I'm gonna move on to the next one. All right, so here's the last bolt. All right, and there it is. Now, ideally, this hub should just pop right off and the backing plate will fall off behind it. Unfortunately, these hubs get stuck in the knuckles, so we're gonna have to hit it with a hammer. All right, so I'm gonna hit the back side of this, maybe on both sides if I can, and try and tap it out of the hub, or out of the knuckle, and let's see what happens. All right, it looks like we can see a little bit of space there, so I know what I'm doing is having some sort of effect. Let's try it some more. All right, we're getting closer. All right. Now we can pull the hub off and the backing plate. There we are. So here we have the old hub and the new hub. You can see they look identical. The back sides also look identical. The difference is that this one is an old hub and you can see the play in it. So if this wasn't making noise already, it would be very soon because it shouldn't have this amount of play in it. You can see the new one is nice and tight, as it should be. So yeah, you can see the old one is worn out. Definitely should have been making noise if it wasn't already. I'm not actually sure because I didn't drive the car. But this new one is going to look and fit and function just like it should. So there might be some rust and debris in here that you want to clean out because you don't want anything to spin around and hit your ABS sensor right here. If you leave a bunch of dirt and debris in here, it could affect your ABS sensor and then you get light on your dashboard that you don't want. So make sure it's nice and clean in here. Once it's all nice and clean, then we can take the backing plate, like so, put it right against the knuckle, and then we can slide the hub on over the axle. And once it's in the general area, we can start feeding the bolts in from the backside. All right, so now what we're going to do is push the axle in, and that gives us some space to feed the bolts in through the back. Now you may have to tap this hub one way or the other with a hammer to get the bolts to line up. It looks like I might have hit it perfect the first time. Wow, that never happens. All right, so let's try for the next one. Push the hub in, or push the axle in, get some space, and then I can feed the bolt in. All right, now we'll do the top one, and the bottom one. You want to get all 4 bolts started in their holes before you tighten any of them down. And you always want to tighten them up evenly so the hub goes into the knuckle nice and flush. All right, they're all started, so now I'm going to start using the 17mm ratchet and socket to tighten it down. All right, so now we're going to torque each one of these to 71 foot-pounds with our torque wrench. All right, they're now all torqued to 71 foot-pounds. Okay, so we're now ready to put this nut on the axle. And if you have a new axle, it spins on nice and easy. If you have an old one, probably not so much. We're going to just hand tighten it for now, and then we're going to drop this car down to the ground, and we're going to torque it to the right spec. All right, so now let's drop it down to the ground. All right, so now we want to torque this to 159 foot-pounds. Now, since we have the other wheel on the ground, it's actually preventing this from spinning right now. But if you had both wheels off of the car, you would need to use the pry bar trick that I mentioned earlier. So I'll show you how to do that. You can do it just like this. I like to put a couple of lug nuts on to kind of hold the pry bar in place. And then as you turn this, it's going to put the pry bar down on the ground, and then you can torque it to the right torque. And then, of course, you can remove your pry bar. Just like that. It's an easy way to do this without a friend. All right, so now we want to spike this nut down into this groove, and that will prevent it from coming off if it ever were to come loose. Now, it shouldn't because you torqued it to 159 foot-pounds, but, you know, weird things happen. So what we're going to do is put our punch right here, and then we're going to whack it with a hammer like this. As long as I can hold it. So now we've speared that in place, and now it won't go anywhere. All right, so now we're just going to slide the rotor into place over the hub. Sometimes I like to put a lug nut on there just to kind of hold it in place while I'm working with it. That way it doesn't slide off and get in a weird position when I'm putting the pads on. So here we have the caliper bracket, and there's a few things that you want to do before you put this back on the car. One of the things is you want to make sure that these things slide in and out smoothly. So this one, you can see it's a little bit sticky, so we'll want to clean that out. This one, kind of the same thing. There's probably some old grease in it, so we'll clean that out. And then down here are some brackets. On each side of the caliper, there's these little stainless brackets, and we want to pop these off and just clean the whole area really well. Because if your brake pads stick, then you'll end up wearing them unevenly, and you have to replace them sooner than you should. So we'll pop these things off, and we'll clean them with some brake parts cleaner and a wire brush. Make sure everything's nice and clean for the brake pads to ride on. I'm going to spray it down with some brake parts cleaner and then get it with a wire brush to make sure the whole area is nice and clean. So now we're going to clip these brackets right back in here. And with them clipped back in, I'm going to spray them down and clean them with the wire brush. That way they'll be held in place by the caliper bracket while I clean them. All right, so now the actual caliper brackets here are nice and clean. So now we're going to pull out these slider pins. And I just want to make sure that there's no rust inside, and I want to make sure they're nice and clean, and maybe even have a nice new coating of grease. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean these off. And you don't want a lot of grease on these things. You just want the lightest possible coating, because if you put too much grease, then they won't slide all the way in the hole, and it creates like a hydraulic situation that's not good. So we're just going to put a light coating of grease on here, and then put it right back in the hole and make sure that it slides in and out nice and easily. The other thing to note on this is that the bottom bolt is a little bit different than the top bolt. So initially they look the same, but once you clean them, you'll notice that this one has a rubber ring on the bottom of it. So this is the bottom bolt. You want to make sure you put them in the right spots. Came out the bottom, so put it right back in the bottom. And then we'll put a little grease on it, just a dab. Again, you don't want to put too much, and then we'll slide it right back in, and then we'll make sure that it moves in and out nice and smooth. All right. If these things were rusty, you'd want to either replace your caliper altogether, or get some new bolts, or clean them really, really well so that there's no rust in there, and then re-grease them to make sure that they move smoothly. Your caliper rides on these, and if they become stuck, you'll end up wearing your brake pads unevenly, which you don't want. All right, so we're going to slide the caliper bracket right back onto the knuckle and put the two bolts back in. Just like that. And we'll snug them up with the 17mm socket on the 3/8 ratchet. So we're at a point where we can slide the brake pads in. What I like to do is put a little dab of grease right on these ears, here and here. And that way, when they're in the sliders in the caliper bracket, they will hopefully slide for a long time to come. Around New England, where we are, this is a problem because rust builds up in these caliper brackets, and it ends up making the brake pad stick. So we want to prevent that, so that's why I like to put the grease on the edge of the brake pads like that. Not everybody does it, it's sort of a preference thing, but I'm going to go ahead and do it because that's just how I do it. You obviously don't want to get your grease on the pad itself or on the rotor, so you have to be extra careful. All right, now they're in place. So we're at a point where we need to compress this piston into the caliper. There's a whole bunch of different ways you can do this. You could use some big groove jaw pliers, you could use a big C-clamp, or if you have a brake piston caliper compression tool, you can use that as well. So that's what we're going to use because we happen to have one here. All you do is put it in here, and then you can compress the piston. All right, it's all compressed. So now we're going to slide this onto the caliper bracket. So now we can put the two bolts in the caliper, and they are supposed to be torqued to 25 foot-pounds. And earlier, we tightened up the caliper brackets, and we're going to torque those to 79 foot-pounds as well. So we'll do this one first to 25 foot-pounds. All right, we got that. Perfect. All right, so now we're going to do the caliper brackets to 79 foot-pounds. All right, it's all torqued to spec. We can put the wheel back on the car. So we're going to lift it up, slide it right on. And then always start your lug nuts by hand because you don't want to cross thread them. Now I like to tighten all these up by hand before I actually put the torque wrench on. That one's a little stiff, so we'll go to this one. All right, we've now got our torque wrench set to 76 foot-pounds, and we're going to go ahead and torque this. Now that it's back on the ground, we can torque it and the wheel won't turn. So let's do that. All right, I just like double checking them, just in case I missed one or something. All right, now we're all torqued.